Most people believe reality changes when you decide harder, think more positively, or finally get clear about what you want. That assumption feels reasonable, it feels intuitive, and yet, if it were true, effort would work far more consistently than it does. Intentions would translate cleanly into outcomes, vision boards would not gather dust, the gap between knowing and experiencing would not be so familiar. Something else is at play, and it has been quietly shaping your experience long before you ever tried to improve it. What if reality is not responding to what you want at all? What if it is responding to something far simpler, far more constant, and far less dramatic than intention, emotion, or belief? What if the determining factor has always been where your attention is resting, moment after moment, long before thought enters the picture? Attention is so close to you that it becomes invisible. You rarely question it because it feels like you. It feels like the background operator of experience, not the mechanism itself. Yet attention is the only thing that is always present. Before a thought forms, attention is already there. Before a feeling arises, attention has already landed somewhere. Before an action is taken, attention has already selected what matters and what does not. Most people assume attention is neutral, that it simply follows experience. But attention does not follow reality. It precedes it. Attention selects, filters, and stabilizes experience before you ever label what is happening. This is why two people can be in the same situation and live in entirely different realities. The environment may be shared, but attention is not. From early on, you are taught to work with outcomes, fix the result, change the circumstance, improve the situation. But no one teaches you to look at the placement of attention that made the situation feel inevitable in the first place. You are encouraged to manage symptoms, not the signal beneath them. Attention is not the same as focus. Focus is narrow and effortful. Attention is broader, quieter, and far more powerful. It is the simple act of contact. Whatever attention touches begins to organize itself around that contact, not instantly, not magically, but reliably. If attention rests on what is missing, reality begins to organize around absence. If attention repeatedly returns to threat, instability begins to feel normal. If attention settles into openness, space appears where there was none before, not because the world has changed, but because relevance has changed, and relevance determines what solidifies. Here is the part most people miss. Attention is not a single moment, it is a pattern. It returns to the same places again and again, often without your awareness, and repetition creates rhythm. Rhythm creates stability. Stability is what reality responds to. This is where the idea of frequency begins, not as a mystical concept, but as an observable one. Frequency is simply pattern over time. It is not what you pay attention to once, it is where attention keeps landing when you are not trying to control it. It is what pulls you back again and again, even when you tell yourself you are thinking about something else. You do not need to believe this for it to be operating. Attention has been shaping your experience long before you started questioning it. It shaped what you noticed as a child. It shaped what felt possible or impossible. It shaped what you learned to expect from people, from effort, from life itself. Most frustration comes from trying to override attention with intention. You decide what you want, but your attention continues to rest elsewhere. You want peace, but attention keeps scanning for problems. You want expansion, but attention keeps returning to limitation. You want change, but attention remains loyal to the familiar. This creates internal friction, not because you are doing something wrong, but because intention is trying to steer what attention has already stabilized. Reality responds to the stronger signal, and attention is almost always stronger than conscious desire. This is why force rarely works. Trying harder often amplifies resistance. The more you attempt to control outcomes, the more attention fragments. One part of attention watches for results. Another part checks for failure. Another part judges progress. The signal becomes noisy, inconsistent, and unstable. And unstable attention produces unstable experience. The shift begins not by changing what you want, but by seeing what attention is actually doing, not conceptually, directly. Where does it rest when nothing is demanding it? What does it return to when you are tired, unguarded, or alone? What patterns repeat without effort? This is not about blame. Attention patterns are learned, not chosen. They form through experience, conditioning, and survival. At one point, they were adaptive. They helped you navigate uncertainty. They helped you belong. They helped you stay safe. But over time, they can outlive their usefulness while continuing to operate automatically. The moment you see this, something subtle begins to loosen. You realize you are not fighting reality itself. You are interacting with a tuning mechanism you were never shown how to notice. Attention is not passive, it is not innocent, it is not neutral. It is the hidden variable that has been organizing your experience all along. And once you begin to see attention, not as something you use, but as something that moves in patterns, the relationship between you and reality begins to change, because the signal underneath experience has finally come into view, and that changes everything that follows. If attention were neutral, reality would feel far more random than it does. Events would arise without pattern, circumstances would not cluster. The same themes would not repeat themselves across different relationships, environments, or stages of life, and yet most people notice something very different. Similar situations keep reappearing, familiar tensions resurface in new forms. Progress seems to stall in recognizable ways. These patterns are not coincidences, they are signatures of attention behaving in consistent rhythms. Attention is often described as something you direct, as if it were a tool you pick up and point. But attention is not primarily deliberate. Most of the time, it moves automatically. It drifts, settles, avoids, or locks on without instruction. It is shaped by habit, memory, and expectation long before conscious choice enters the picture. This is why you can decide to focus on one thing while your attention keeps returning to another. Intention speaks loudly. Attention whispers continuously. Reality listens to the whisper. To understand attention as frequency, you do not need to think in terms of energy or vibration. You only need to notice repetition. Frequency is not intensity, it is recurrence. It is how often attention returns to the same tone, the same concern, the same orientation toward experience. Over time, this repetition becomes predictable. Predictability is what allows reality to stabilize. Think about how quickly attention assigns significance. A passing thought can be ignored, or it can be pulled into the foreground. A sensation can fade, or it can become the center of experience. A possibility can be dismissed, or it can quietly reorganize your choices. None of this happens randomly. Attention is constantly sorting what matters from what does not. And whatever is repeatedly marked as relevant begins to shape the structure of lived reality. This is why attention is never neutral. It is always doing something, even when you are unaware of it. It is emphasizing certain aspects of experience while excluding others. It is reinforcing familiar interpretations while filtering out alternatives. Over time, this selective process hardens into what feels like the way things are. Most people assume reality creates attention, that circumstances pull focus, that events demand awareness. But look closely, and you will see that attention often arrives first. It scans for confirmation. It looks for evidence that aligns with what it already expects. It highlights certain cues and overlooks others. Experience then seems to validate the very patterns attention has been reinforcing. This is not a flaw in perception. It is how perception works. Attention cannot hold everything at once, so it chooses. And what it chooses repeatedly becomes the dominant signal-shaping experience. Here is where frequency becomes useful as a lens. When attention returns to the same orientation again and again, it develops momentum. That momentum is what gives attention its apparent weight. It begins to feel real, justified, unquestionable. But what you are actually experiencing is not reality itself. You are experiencing a stabilized pattern of attention interacting with circumstances. Notice how different states of attention feel. There is attention that is tight, vigilant, always anticipating what might go wrong. There is attention that is scattered, jumping from one stimulus to the next, unable to settle. There is attention that is absorbed, spacious, quietly receptive. Each of these has a distinct rhythm. Each returns to itself in recognizable ways, and each produces a very different sense of reality. When attention is tight, the world feels demanding. When attention is scattered, the world feels overwhelming. When attention is open, the world feels responsive. These are not changes in the external environment, they are changes in the pattern through which experience is being filtered. The mistake most people make is trying to change the content of attention instead of noticing its rhythm. They try to replace thoughts, override feelings, or impose new beliefs. But attention continues to move in the same way underneath those efforts. The signal does not change, even if the surface language does. This is why surface-level change rarely lasts. You can repeat affirmations while attention remains contracted. You can visualize success while attention keeps returning to doubt. You can speak positively while attention scans for threat. The words may shift, but the frequency remains the same. Reality responds to frequency, not language. When attention behaves in a consistent rhythm, it creates a stable field of relevance. Certain opportunities become visible. Certain risks seem unavoidable. Certain outcomes feel likely. Over time, this sense of likelihood becomes self-confirming, not because reality is conspiring, but because attention has made some possibilities vivid and others nearly invisible. This is how reality begins to feel personal, even when it is not. Attention creates a lens, and the lens shapes what appears to be out there. The more stable the lens, the more convincing the world it reveals. Seeing this does not mean trying to fix attention. It means recognizing that attention already has structure. It already has habits. It already has momentum. And until those patterns are seen clearly, they will continue to operate automatically, quietly tuning experience in familiar ways. The moment attention is recognized as patterned rather than passive, something subtle shifts. You stop assuming that experience is simply happening to you. You begin to notice the rhythm underneath it. And once rhythm is visible, it becomes possible to relate to attention differently, not by force, but by awareness. Recognition is the threshold. Because when you see that attention has a frequency, you begin to understand why reality feels as consistent as it does, and why it starts to feel different the moment that consistency is interrupted. And that is where the tuning truly begins. Once you begin to see attention as patterned rather than passive, a deeper question naturally arises. How does something as subtle as attention influence something as tangible as lived reality? The answer is not mystical, and it is not abstract. It is mechanical in the simplest sense of the word. Reality does not respond to isolated moments of attention. It responds to consistency. Attention is the gateway through which experience becomes organized. It determines what is noticed, what is reinforced, and what is ignored. Over time, this selective process creates structure, not instantly, not dramatically, but gradually and reliably. Reality does not rearrange itself in response to what you think once. It stabilizes around what attention repeatedly treats as relevant. Consider how memory works. Experiences that receive sustained attention are remembered, those that do not fade quickly. Memory then influences expectation. Expectation influences interpretation. Interpretation influences behavior, and behavior influences circumstance. At no point does reality suddenly shift. It coheres, it aligns itself around a pattern that has already been established through attention. This is why life often feels self-reinforcing. Patterns seem to repeat even when you are trying to move beyond them. It is not because you are stuck, it is because attention has already created a stable orientation, and stability is what reality reflects most easily. Attention functions like a selector. Out of countless possible details, meanings, and trajectories, it highlights a narrow band and treats it as significant. That significance becomes a signal. The signal determines what is engaged with, acted upon, and remembered. Over time, the world begins to appear as if it is confirming that signal, when in fact it is responding to it. This is where the idea of tuning becomes precise. Tuning does not mean creating something from nothing. It means aligning with what already exists in potential. Reality contains far more possibilities than can ever be experienced at once. Attention narrows that field. It does not invent outcomes. It selects which outcomes are allowed to become visible and consistent. When attention repeatedly returns to a particular orientation, reality organizes itself around that orientation because it is the path of least resistance. Familiar interpretations are easier to maintain, familiar outcomes are easier to notice, familiar reactions are easier to reinforce. Over time, this ease becomes momentum. Momentum is what makes reality feel solid. This is also why sudden insight can feel disorienting. When attention shifts abruptly, the familiar structures that once felt inevitable begin to loosen. Things that once seemed fixed feel less certain. New possibilities begin to appear not because they were created, but because attention is no longer filtering them out. Most people assume that change requires force, that to alter reality something dramatic must be done. But dramatic effort often destabilizes attention rather than clarifying it. The signal becomes fragmented. One part of attention wants change, another part monitors risk, another part checks for proof. The result is inconsistency. Reality responds to coherence, not urgency. Coherent attention is not intense, it is undivided, it does not argue with itself, it does not constantly check for confirmation. It rests. And when attention rests consistently, reality begins to reflect that stability. This is why some changes feel effortless in hindsight, not because they were easy, but because attention had already shifted long before the external circumstances followed. The outer change was simply the final stage of a process that had already been underway internally. The mistake is assuming that attention must be directed toward outcomes. In truth, attention shapes outcomes indirectly by shaping what feels relevant, possible, and expected. When attention changes its rhythm, behavior changes naturally. When behavior changes, circumstances follow. The sequence is quiet, but it is reliable. You can see this clearly in everyday life. When attention is preoccupied, opportunities are missed. When attention is open, they seem to appear unexpectedly. The difference is not luck, it is receptivity. Attention determines what can be received. This is also why trying to manifest specific results often feels strained. Attention becomes locked onto the absence of what is desired. The signal being broadcast is not fulfillment, but lack. Reality responds by organizing experience around that signal, reinforcing the sense of distance between you and the outcome. When attention relaxes its grip on results and settles into presence, the signal changes. The rhythm becomes smoother, less fragmented. Reality no longer needs to resist or comply, it simply aligns. None of this requires belief. It does not depend on metaphysics or faith. It can be observed directly by watching how experience reorganizes when attention shifts its pattern. Small changes in attention produce subtle changes in perception. Over time, those subtle changes accumulate into tangible differences in how life unfolds. This is why the title matters. The second you see attention as frequency, reality tunes itself. Not instantly, not magically, but inevitably. Because once attention is seen clearly, it stops fighting itself. And when attention stops fighting itself, the signal stabilizes. Reality does not need to be convinced. It does not need to be forced. It responds to what is steady, consistent, and coherent. It responds to the pattern that is already in place. And once you understand this, the question is no longer how to change reality. The question becomes simpler, quieter, and far more powerful. What pattern of attention are you sustaining right now? At this point, it becomes easier to see why so much effort produces so little change. Control feels like the logical response when reality does not cooperate. If things are not moving, you push harder. If outcomes are uncertain, you tighten your grip. But control does not stabilize attention, it fractures it, and fractured attention produces noise. Control is not the same as clarity. Control is attention divided against itself. One part of attention is trying to force a direction. Another part is monitoring results. Another part is bracing for disappointment. None of these parts are wrong, but together they create interference. The signal becomes inconsistent and reality responds accordingly. When attention is split, it loses coherence. Instead of a steady rhythm, it oscillates rapidly between desire and doubt, effort and evaluation. This oscillation is exhausting, not because change is difficult, but because attention is being pulled in multiple directions at once. The system never settles long enough for reality to organize around it. This is why forcing outcomes often leads to short-lived results. You may achieve something through sheer effort, but the underlying pattern of attention has not changed. As soon as pressure is released, attention returns to its familiar rhythm, and reality follows. The change does not hold because the signal was never stable. Most people confuse control with power. They assume that more effort means more influence. But influence comes from consistency, not intensity. A steady signal shapes reality more effectively than a loud but erratic one. Control amplifies intensity while reducing consistency. Notice what happens internally when you try to control a situation. Attention narrows, awareness contracts, the field of possibility shrinks. Everything outside the desired outcome becomes a threat or a distraction. This may create temporary focus, but it also eliminates flexibility. Reality becomes something to battle rather than something to interact with. This contraction is not subtle. It has a felt quality. The body tightens, the breath shortens, the mind loops. Attention becomes rigid, and rigidity is the opposite of coherence. Coherent attention is relaxed, not passive, but open. It is not trying to eliminate uncertainty. It is able to remain present without constantly checking for results. This presence allows attention to settle into a stable rhythm, and stability is what reality reflects most easily. Control disrupts this process because it introduces constant evaluation. Is it working? Am I doing enough? What if this fails? Each question pulls attention out of its resting state and forces it to jump. The signal becomes choppy. Reality mirrors that instability through delays, obstacles, or unexpected complications. This is feedback. Reality is not resisting you. It is responding to the quality of attention being applied. When attention is calm and consistent, reality appears supportive. When attention is anxious and divided, reality appears uncooperative. The difference lies not in the world, but in the signal being sustained. Many people attempt to bypass this by focusing on techniques. They look for methods to control outcomes more efficiently. But techniques only work when attention is coherent. Without coherence, techniques become another layer of effort. another source of fragmentation. This is why periods of genuine surrender often produce unexpected breakthroughs. Surrender is not giving up, it is releasing the attempt to control. When control drops away, attention naturally regains coherence. The signal smooths out. Reality responds by reorganizing itself with less resistance. You may have noticed this in moments when you stopped trying and things resolved themselves, not because effort was unnecessary, but because attention finally stopped interfering with itself. The system was allowed to stabilize. This does not mean you do nothing. Action still occurs. Decisions are still made, but they arise from a different place. They arise from clarity rather than compulsion, from presence rather than pressure. The paradox is that the more you try to control reality, the more attention fragments, and the more attention fragments, the less influence you actually have. Influence returns when attention stops fighting itself and settles into coherence. This is the turning point. Not a new technique, not a new belief, but a shift in how attention is allowed to behave. When you stop trying to force reality into alignment, attention naturally stabilizes, and when attention stabilizes, reality begins to tune itself. Not because you commanded it to, but because the signal finally became clear. There is a moment in every genuine shift where effort quietly falls away. Not because you have given up, but because something becomes obvious. You see that the struggle was never with reality itself. It was within attention, and once that is seen, the system begins to reorganize on its own. Coherence is not something you create, it is what remains when interference ends. When attention is no longer pulled between opposing demands, it naturally settles. This settling is not dramatic, it does not announce itself, it feels like space, like things finally lining up without being forced. Most people assume coherence means feeling good or staying positive, but coherence has nothing to do with mood. It has to do with alignment within attention itself. When attention is divided, reality feels resistant. When attention is unified, reality feels responsive. The content of experience matters far less than the quality of the signal underneath it. Think of how often attention argues with itself. One part wants change, another part fears consequence. One part reaches forward, another pulls back. This internal tug-of-war creates constant oscillation. The signal never stabilizes. Reality reflects that instability through hesitation, delay, and contradiction. Coherence begins when attention is allowed to rest without being immediately redirected. When you stop trying to replace what is present with what should be present, when you stop demanding that experience justify itself. In that moment, attention stops splitting. It becomes whole. This wholeness is subtle, but its effects are not. When attention is coherent, it holds experience without tension. It does not need to amplify or suppress. It allows what is present to be fully present, and in doing so, it creates clarity. Clarity is not the absence of uncertainty. It is the absence of internal conflict. When attention is clear, decisions arise naturally. You do not have to calculate every move. You do not have to constantly evaluate outcomes. Action flows from what is seen, not from what is feared. This is why coherence often feels like confidence, even when nothing externally has changed. Reality responds to this state because it is stable. A stable signal is easy to reflect. A fragmented one is not. When attention stops fighting itself, the environment begins to feel less oppositional. Not because obstacles vanish, but because your relationship to them changes. You stop reacting, you start responding. This is where many people misinterpret what is happening. They assume reality has become kinder or more aligned. In truth, attention has become coherent, and coherence makes reality feel different because it removes noise from perception. Noise distorts timing, it creates false urgency, it amplifies minor setbacks into major threats. When noise drops, timing becomes more precise. Opportunities are noticed at the right moment. Decisions feel cleaner. The sense of being out of sync dissolves. Coherence also changes how long attention can rest in one place. Fragmented attention cannot stay with anything for long. It becomes restless, scanning for reassurance or control. Coherent attention is patient. It does not rush to resolution. This patience allows processes to complete naturally rather than being prematurely interrupted. This is why forcing change often delays it. Interruption breaks coherence. Letting a process unfold without interference allows it to resolve. Attention learns to trust itself. Reality reflects that trust by responding more smoothly. Importantly, coherence does not mean passivity. It does not mean waiting or disengaging. It means acting without internal resistance. When action arises from coherence, it is precise. It does not waste energy. It does not need constant correction. You may notice that when attention is coherent, effort feels different. It is not strained. It does not deplete you. It feels proportional to the situation. You do what is needed and then you stop. There is no lingering tension. This is the state in which reality seems to tune itself. This is because the signal underneath experience has stabilized. Reality no longer has to contend with contradictory inputs. It can respond cleanly. Once coherence is experienced, even briefly, it becomes recognizable. You begin to sense when attention is fragmented and when it is whole. This awareness alone starts to change how you engage with life. You catch yourself earlier, you stop forcing sooner, you allow attention to settle more often. And each time you do, the signal strengthens. Coherence is not something you hold permanently. Attention will fragment again. Habits will reassert themselves. But now you know the difference. You have felt what it is like when attention stops fighting itself. And that recognition makes all the difference, because once coherence is known, you stop mistaking effort for power. You stop trying to overpower reality. You let attention do what it does best when it is not being interfered with. And reality, as it always has, responds to the signal it is given. When attention becomes something you can see rather than something you are lost inside of, a quiet shift takes place. You stop reacting as quickly, not because you are suppressing responses, but because attention is no longer being hijacked automatically. There is space between what happens and how you meet it. And in that space, reality begins to feel different. Most reactions are not responses to the present moment. They are echoes of familiar attention patterns. Something triggers a rhythm you have lived in before, and attention snaps back into place without consultation. The body tightens, the mind moves ahead. Outcomes are anticipated before anything has actually occurred. This is momentum. Living from attention means recognizing momentum without being carried by it. You notice when attention starts to contract, rush, or fixate. You do not correct it, you do not judge it, you simply see it. And seeing it interrupts the pattern. This is the deepest shift of all, not changing what you feel, not controlling what you think, but noticing where attention is landing and how long it stays there. That noticing alone changes the relationship between you and experience. From this perspective, life stops feeling like something that needs constant management. You no longer feel responsible for forcing outcomes into place. Instead, you stay with what is actually present, allowing attention to remain coherent. Decisions arise from clarity rather than urgency. Action becomes responsive rather than reactive. This does not make life predictable, it makes it workable. You are no longer trying to anticipate every possibility or guard against every outcome. You are engaged with what is happening now, trusting that attention will adjust as reality unfolds. One of the most surprising changes is how little effort is required to maintain this state. You are not holding attention in place, You are allowing it to rest. When it drifts, you notice. When it tightens, you notice. That noticing is enough to prevent fragmentation. As this becomes familiar, you may realize that many of the things you once chased begin to arrive on their own. Not because you summoned them, but because attention was no longer interfering. When attention is coherent, you are receptive. When you are receptive, reality has room to respond. This is where the phrase reality tunes itself becomes experiential rather than conceptual. You are no longer trying to orchestrate outcomes. You are maintaining clarity of signal. The rest follows naturally. Living this way also changes how you relate to uncertainty. Uncertainty no longer feels like a threat that must be eliminated. It becomes a space of potential. Attention does not rush to fill it with assumptions. It stays open, and openness allows new configurations to emerge. You begin to trust timing not as an abstract idea, but as something you can feel. When attention is coherent, you sense when to act and when to wait. There is less second-guessing, less internal debate, more alignment between perception and response. This is not a permanent state. Attention will still fragment. Old habits will still surface. But now you recognize what is happening. You do not panic. You return to coherence more easily. And each return strengthens the pattern. Over time, this changes how you see yourself. You are no longer defined by reactions, moods, or circumstances. You see yourself as the placement of attention itself, stable, adaptable, and responsive. The title of this video is not a metaphor, it is a description. The second you see attention as frequency, reality tunes itself. Not because you demanded it, not because you controlled it, but because the signal underneath experience became clear. Nothing needed to be added, nothing needed to be forced. Attention simply stopped fighting itself. And when that happens, reality does what it has always done. It responds.